Hello and welcome. His travels take him to the most remote corners of the earth, and he explores regions many others have missed. But he's also on an active mission to preserve ancient traditions and cultures. This week on One, meet the Chinese-born explorer and conservationist Wong Hao-man. Travel began quite early for this adventurer who says he felt something of a misfit in the colonial atmosphere of his birthplace, Hong Kong. Wong Hao-man left the colony to study photography in the US at the University of Wisconsin, but found himself in the middle of America's heated debate over the Vietnam War. Still, his persistent nature soon had him exploring remote locations for National Geographic, for whom he undertook a trek into the hinterlands of China. That eventually led him to proving the geography books wrong by identifying the true source of the mighty Yangtze River. Perhaps most importantly, he developed a passion for not only documenting, but helping to preserve ancient traditions and cultures. In 1987, he founded the China Exploration and Research Society to make sure that the living history of remote places doesn't disappear. Hao-man, it's great to speak with you. Thank you for your time.
Oh, thank you too.
Now, you've been described, Time magazine described you as China's greatest living explorer. You were honored in 2002 among their selection of 25 heroes of Asia, and you've certainly been on some remarkable adventures. So it makes me wonder, what drives you to explore?
Well, I've been always curious. I always felt that, perhaps, I haven't quite grown up. And, when people ask me what it takes to be an explorer, I said, you show me a 3-year-old kid and I show you an explorer. So I probably keep to at least the curiosity of a 3-year-old kid. And that's basically, I think that's the drive. I'm always very curious and inquisitive and trying to seek the unknown.
So what skills make a good explorer?
I think one of the first rule of thumb is that you're willing to be lost. So I always tell people, as an explorer, you're not always hitting it right. So there's going to be a lot of surprises, and even though we set out with a goal, sometimes what's along the way came with so many surprises that actually at times it even surpassed your original goal.
You've covered a lot of ground geographically, of course, but I always wonder, with the amount of technology there is and the exploration that's been done, is there a lot left to discover?
Well, certainly, because I think, it's not only that as always, you need to be the first one there. I think these days with more technology, we can actually be access to much of the knowledge that's been gained before. So with our new modern viewpoint, we can reinterpret it. So I don't think it's only just bringing back content, but the context, the interpretation of what we see. So of course, there are cases that we are actually being the first one, let's say, to define certain aspect, like, we've defined the source of the Yangtze, the Mekong, and the Yellow River. But, it's not always like that.
You're unique, though, in that you like to not only get to remote places, but to leave them in better condition than when you left. And it's a kind of, improving the world in which you live in and which you visit. So what motivates that?
Well, I think that's one of the watershed in my earlier career as a journalist and explorer, is that I used to make discoveries, write about it, share it with the rest of the world. And then next time I go around and you see it disintegrating, vanishing. A lot of those are, of course, part of the natural process of evolution and modernization. But at the same time, many of these cultural and natural heritage, I think in order to preserve it, though in some cases we can actually help maintain it. So, that's why I move beyond just exploration into conservation to culture and nature. In particular, of course, I work mainly in China, western part of China, remote parts of China. And in those days that I started working 35 years ago, China has that fairly low in their priority. It's not a powerhouse. It's not a wealthy nation. Economically, it's quite backward. And of course, things are changing. These days, of course, they should take those into the forefront. Their educated young people are also engaging in conservation.
There's two sides to the story, though, isn't there? There's the side of allowing the world to discover this part of remote China, for example, that you're exploring and getting them better aware of what's going on there and the people there. And then there's getting the people who live in those remote areas to better understand their environment and look after it more, isn't there?
That's right. I think, in the process of conserving these, they also find their own, let's say, their own national integrity, their own cultural diversity. At times, of course, because they've been economically in the backwaters, it takes them time to look at those that, when an outsider really appreciate it and even come in with resources to preserve it, it actually help their own identity and their own integrity.
Now, it seems that you're willing to make a little trouble from time to time with the philosophy that sometimes it's easier to ask for forgiveness than permission. And I wonder, is that how you manage to get around some of the bureaucracy, especially in China, that you come across?
Yes, in the early years, definitely within the first 20 years, that it's if you're waiting for all the paperwork to get through, you won't get anything done. And very early on, I've learned not to take simply no is not an answer. You always can get around it. And of course, in our projects, a lot of times we deliver results fairly quickly. So by the time they find out, actually, they can see the results a little bit already. So the apology will come easier. They can actually see, oh, you have a good intention.
Now, you were born in Hong Kong at a time when it was very much a British colony. What do you remember of those early years then?
Well, I went to a Christian elementary school and then a Jesuit high school. So it's very regimented, and I think the kind of education we provide, we're provided with, it's actually quite good, but it's geared towards everybody in the mainstream. So you're becoming a doctor, an engineer, or a scholar, or whatever. And very early on, I've been fairly rebellious, so whatever way I can get away with, I try to do that. So I think, I very early on tried to break away from the norm. And of course, I keep one foot in the door such that I'm not a total outcast. It was a Jesuit high school, it's not easy to get through. So I just do all the bare minimum and spend the rest of the time looking at things that are of interest to myself.
What about your parents? How did they influence you? What sort of upbringing did you have under their sort of influence?
Well, my father has always been teaching science. So, all along he was hoping that, we either become doctors or engineers or become a scientist. So I was actually, when I applied to university here in Wisconsin in the US, I was admitted in chemistry. But once I get down to campus and realize that, hey, it's not like in Hong Kong that you're stuck with what you pick. Within the first quarter, I changed to journalism and art. And of course, I'm thousands of miles away. You can't really look over my shoulder anymore. So I departed on a whole different journey that is really basically what I want to seek for myself.
What was the reaction when news got back home?
Oh, God. In those days, you don't get to go home flying back and forth. I didn't, first 3 years, I didn't get to go home, so I was, but the worst part was that, I felt that, I was there to learn something of my own interest. So by the time I got to fourth year, near graduation, the last course, I took an incomplete and left. It was a press law in journalism. And he didn't find out. I got a job offer already. I started working. 2 years later, when we received a letter from the school asking why I didn't finish, and he was, of course, very upset. So I turned in my last paper and got my degree, and I've never seen my diploma again. I gave it to him.
What about your mother? How did she influence you?
Well, the most important part that I think my mother influenced me was that she's fiercely independent. So even growing up, despite that it's a very traditional family, my grandfather was a comprador, and so it's a business family. And I can recall that by the time I'm a teenager, when we have family gatherings, be it lunch or dinner, and I'm always getting bored there and I want to get out. And whenever she felt that I wants to get away, she would just rush me along and said, don't worry. So same like later years when I go out into the remote areas to explore, she always don't want to be a liability. She prepare herself very well and always just let me be able to go without having to worry about anything that's left behind. So I think that through my formative years as well as later years, how she was able to allow me to do what I do is just don't feel that we have to be responsible for her.
Now, with your life growing up in what was very strongly influenced British environment too, did that British culture, the colonial culture, clash in any way with what you were experiencing through your Chinese influence?
I think definitely, because growing up, we weren't taught very much about contemporary Chinese history. So everything about the further back in history, yes, but once you get into, let's say, the last Manchu dynasty, by the Opium War, things become very opaque, and we really don't get any of those education. So it wasn't until I went to America when first of all, when I was in Wisconsin, you really feel that you're a minority, you feel differently from everyone else. In Hong Kong, it's 98% Chinese. So you never question your own identity. So it was when I was in college that I start realizing, hey, I'm very different from everybody else. Then you start going to the library and seek out books to read about the contemporary Chinese history or about Chinese culture. And then suddenly I realized that many of the books are very old and out of date because there was a big gap dealing with modern China. And that's why as soon as I graduated in 1973, I went to China during the Cultural Revolution.
And of course, you were in America at a time when the Vietnam War was a big issue.
And that's right. I think that also got a major influence on me because I was in journalism school and art school, and both of those departments are fairly progressive. I want some margin of being radical. And campuses all over America at that time was having strikes or protests, and a lot of our fellow students are veterans coming back from the Vietnam War. So I think it affected me later on about the thinking process, and always. I won't say intellectualizing it, but at least challenging the mainstream beliefs. And we want to look at, well, what about the other side of the story?
Well, Hao Man, I know you have an interesting tale when it took off as you started exploring. We'll get to that in a moment. We take a short break here with 101. We'll be right back. Welcome back. You're watching 101. We're speaking with iconic Chinese-born explorer Wong Hao Man. It was in the early 70s that everything took off when National Geographic decided to employ you, and you were out with your camera and actually out on your expeditions. Early on, how well prepared were you for that initial trip?
Well, in the early days, China was controlled very tightly, so we can't go very far. I was mainly working for a number of other magazines as well, Architectural Digest, I wrote also for Reader's Digest. But we're mainly covering cultures and architecture, Chinese gardens, a little bit about history. And then came up around 1979, the door opens a little bit more. And I had my first time that I got a chance to look at the huge cultural diversity of China. I remember I was on an assignment to look at the Mongolian yurt, the felt tent, and that's when I look at, wow, all the landscape is different from what I usually know, and the people, the culture, the history is all different. And when I came back to the States and look around in libraries, there's, again, very little written about those areas. So I kind of went on a whole different tangent, and it's focusing on minority cultures, cultural geography, a huge I would call it the backyard of China. And then my early expedition for the National Geographic, I was both a writer and a photographer. So we went out, for 4 months at the time. It was still fairly restrictive. I was able to rent a Jeep from China and with a couple of assistants from China. But those years, it was everything I looked at is totally fascinating. There's simply that as you go back to the record, at least for 50 years, no one has been in those areas. So it accumulated to 6 major expeditions when I was at the National Geographic. The very last one was a 2-year expedition that looked at the Yangtze River from mouth to source. And as a geographic magazine, we were looking carefully at where the source is. So fortunately, I was living in California and very close to NASA's Jet Propulsion Lab. So very early on, we got all these remote sensing data. Today, GPS is no big deal. Back in the early 80s, when you're talking of using remote sensing with satellite images, radar images from the space shuttle, those are fascinating data that we can get our hands on. So through these remote sensing data, we were able to define a new source, a longer source for the Yangtze River.
Actually proving the books wrong must have been quite satisfying because everyone believed it was elsewhere.
That's right, and of course, we're also in later years, we're fortunate that we also, in more recent years, we're able to define the source for the Mekong River as well as that for the Yellow River.
Now tell me about the China Exploration and Research Society you founded. I think initially in Los Angeles in about '87, then later you moved it to Hong Kong.
That's right. I left the National Geographic thinking that there's more I can do rather than just documenting and vanishing culture and kind of disintegration of nature. I felt that I need to be able to do some more research as well as perhaps help in small ways in conservation. So, I founded the organization as a nonprofit in Los Angeles, such that we can go beyond just exploration and work as a journalist. And in the first few years, it was pretty rough because I'm not used to like fundraising and going around giving lecture and have your hat out trying to collect money. So, but in those days, though, however, China was in the backwaters. So whatever money you can get and invest into China in these projects goes a long way. Now things, of course, is very different. So from a tiny little organization, now, of course, we're not membership-based. But at any one time, we're running around 6 to 10 different projects now.
And what results have you seen? How successful has the society been?
We've been fortunate. The last few years, we have done also conservation to archaeological sites, many Tibetan monasteries, nunneries, murals, and then we move on a number of flagship species of animals and birds in Western China. So many of those is also bringing the awareness to the local people. So it's you have to do it in a very sensitive way, let alone the government is always looking over your shoulder. So I think it has been from the late 80s to the early 90s. It's been a little bit of an uphill battle, but now I think China is far more open now. They see that conservation is important. It's not just only for their overall image. I think younger Chinese that are Western educated or educated in China all embrace conservation now.
I know one of your missions is to bring ancient traditions into the 21st century. How do you balance keeping those traditions valuable at their core and yet modernizing?
It is difficult. It's not that we are also evolving. We're finding ways to find it actually. It is equitable. You can't conserve at the same time and trying to hold back their development. So I think in many ways that's why we at times many of these culture are no longer living culture, but preserving them. Like recently, we have a project site in the southern island of Hainan in China. All through the coast of it are resorts already. But deep inside, the indigenous people, that has 1.2 million of it, the Li people, they used to tattoo their face, the women. So this, we found one last village, the very last vestige of their traditional culture, thatched roof houses, adobe walls. And by the time I saw it, they have 2 weeks to survive because they were going to bulldoze the whole village and build upon it with new brick houses, nondescript houses. So we stepped in very last minute and asked the government, can you let us take over, adopt 20 of the houses? We want to preserve them, set up small museums. And recently we bring students in to help us collect all the objects. First day, we actually asked them, go out without any money, collect things that they consider trash, that they're going to throw away. Those are the things that will disappear before we realize it. If they still want to charge you a lot and sell it to you, they're not about to disappear very quickly. So I think a lot of the things that we are preserving is what we obviously think is not worth any money. If it's worth a lot, like you go to an auction and buy something, if you don't get it, it won't disappear. It's going to be in a museum or someone else's hand. So it's the little utility things that they throw away as trash and suddenly you lost, or they are lost.
What has been your greatest personal challenge?
Now is a time that I need to start looking back. While we're moving forward in exploration and some small conservation projects, we have several small museums ourselves. But at the same time, we really start to organize the huge amount of material collected. 35 years of work is a long period of work. We have 250,000 slides covering Western China. Many of those you can't turn back in time to document these. And out of those 250,000 slides, almost 10,000 of them are decaying, they're molding. So we just start looking into how we're going to preserve what we have collected, organize it, make it accessible. I think also our own story. What we have done, writing it down in books or in documentary films. We make around 3 or 4 documentaries right now. So that in future generation, they look at it and they get inspired. I read a book from 100 years ago, 200 years ago, I get inspired. Then perhaps then you have many successors because if you can inspire them to take up those responsibility of their own generation with perhaps better resources, better technique, better technology than we do. They may look at what we've done and felt, gee, we do it in a very stupid way. But nonetheless, I think it's important that we show our commitment and we put in what we have to trying to preserve for the future generation.
Of all the things you've done, in all the projects you've undertaken and the places you've been, what is the single most important lesson you've learned?
I think if we look back at it, of all the different case history that we have, is that really most of the issues we had started with is quite daunting. And looking back, I felt that, gee, can't believe we have gotten done so much of it. And I think it's just really taking that first step and stay with it. At times, of course, the obstacle can be very great, but I don't back off. I turn around and come back again. So, and that's why I keep a number of projects on the plate at the same time, so I can move from one to the other. Of course, I get bored easily too, so I need several projects. People sometimes criticize me, well, how many, you have too many interests. I say, I could just get bored too easily.
I know for a fact your map is very crowded with pins, the places you've been. Any big gaps? Is there any one place you really haven't got to what you want to get to?
In reality now, I think because, we've been involved in China for 35 years. And one thing, we work heavily on both nature and culture, which means a lot of wildlife and indigenous culture. And both of those aspects don't respect political border very well. So we start moving across national frontiers and hoping that by putting similar projects in the inland frontiers of China, not only that we are preserving culture and nature, there's an added dimension that is about peace and about friendship. So we started moving projects into northern Myanmar, into northern Vietnam. We're looking at Laos. We've recently looked at Bhutan. So I think, and that's probably the next challenge for us, is to take similar projects that we feel that we have experience and success across national border to share with our neighboring countries. And I think we need to, being able to use satellite for a long time, we need to take a higher view anyway. I think once we take a higher view, we won't look at the nitty-gritty and feel, I think a lot of the conflicts is because on the ground that we're really looking only at the small, very immediate problems.
How would you like to be remembered? What would you like your legacy to be?
Perhaps it's still as an explorer, that I'm curious, that I'm like a 3-year-old, and in terms of the curiosity, I hope intellectually I'm not 3 years old. But I think that if people can feel that, I think I would like that throughout my life, that I have lived up to that spirit of exploration.
Wong Hao Man, I wish you safe travels. Thank you very much for your time.
Okay, thank you. Okay, yeah.